Welcome everyone to Male Fuzz TV. I am Peter and today I'm going to be talking about The X-Files Season 2 Episode 23. It's called Soft Light. So spoilers for the episode as always. Tony Shalhoub's in this one. He's relatively well known. I don't know how well known he was at the time when this aired, but obviously he's fairly well known now. Yeah, this is an interesting one with a fun premise. It's got a simple premise that's complex in its like origin and exactly what's going on, but very simple to understand and follow in terms of like how it's going to function in the plot, right? The simple premise of this man has a shadow that if anyone steps on that shadow, they will be sucked into it as if it's a black hole. And this man is also not a villain necessarily himself. He's not doing this intentionally. In fact, something's kind of attached itself to him. Whether that's something supernatural or more, well, obviously it's not. It's obviously not something that's normal. But what I mean is that is it more like a demonic thing, or is it something that's come out from a different dimension because of like how he got this like ability or this shadow thing in the first place? I'll talk about all that as we go. So I mostly liked this quite a bit. If anything, I think I actually liked it a bit more than last episode. Mainly just because it is a fun premise and it leads to a lot of fun scenes. There's a couple of nice little touches in how it plays. I think what's good about it is that it's a very, very, at least at face value, some very simple rules that you can understand almost immediately. As soon as they establish the idea of stepping onto the shadow, it potentially creates a lot of tension whenever someone's about to step on his shadow. There's a constant danger that if someone just like angles a light differently, maybe the shadow will hit someone. Like, I actually think the premise is very, very good. I do think that it suffers a little bit in this episode, though, because I wish that they really strictly adhered to it and made it feel like it was always something that we had to think about. Because what I mean by this is that it feels like for large stretches of scenes, it really feels like there should be a shadow somewhere that would be a problem. And the only reason why there isn't one is because the camera's just choosing not to show it. Not because they've went to the effort of always making sure he's not casting a shadow anywhere that he shouldn't be for the content of the scene. And I almost wish that they really played with this in the direction as well by always having like wide shots for all of his scenes. Not the whole time, but like the idea that you're always making the audience aware of where he is, where his shadow is in relation to other people. And if you're telling me that there's no shadows around him because of soft light, then really show me it. Like, give me a wide shot and show me that there's hardly any shadow or there's very soft shadow at best. Like, always let me see it. Let me always be thinking about it, because in theory, like I said, like in any scene, if he just like steps to the left a little bit, like he might create a shadow in a place that's dangerous for someone else. If someone just angles a light in a certain way, I mean, going down the street with like car headlights, like potentially coming round the corner at any point could be really scary. And does it only count if the shadow's on the floor? It seems to, because that seems to be the only time we see it happen in this episode. That's something we could have played with a little bit more. So I do think there was some stuff was left on the table for sure. But I do think the raw premise is really fun. And I guess part of my critiquing here of them being a little sort of undefined with the rules, even though the rules appear to be very simple, it doesn't feel super defined in the sense that, like, not only are they not constantly showing and making me aware and be thinking about where he's casting a shadow, because they're just kind of leaving it off camera just so that we don't think about it, or if we are thinking about it, we don't know for sure if he is or he isn't, even though it feels like he should be. It also, in the opening scene, the shadow does something kind of unnatural, where the shadow goes under a door. You know, so he's standing in a hallway and the light casts a shadow going back across to another door, but instead of because normally the shadow would go along the floor and then it would go up the door, right? Like that's how shadows work, depending on the angle of the light, I suppose. But what I would not expect to see is the shadow to go under the door and the shadow to be inside the other room. Right? That wouldn't happen. The door is blocking the shadow. But it happens in the opening scene, which, I'm not saying that's a problem per se, but it does maybe open the door for them to have this wiggle room of constantly saying, "Oh, it's just it's supernatural. It's doing things that's not real or whatever. It can do other things, so therefore we don't have to always have it follow complete laws of physics, I guess." And that leads to it being wishy-washy in general. And the weird thing about it is that other than this scene, I don't think the shadow ever does anything really that unnatural again. Like, that's the only thing. It's right at the start of the episode, the cold open, the shadow goes under the door. I don't think there's any point in the rest of the episode where the shadow does anything out of the ordinary. It's just a shadow he's casting on the floor. But people can remind me if I'm wrong, other than the fact that it's sucking people into a black hole. I mean, obviously that's always happening. I just mean in terms of how the shadow is being cast, it's always just doing normal stuff for the rest of the episode. But yeah, so like, love the premise, and I do think that it is a really fun idea for a story. I also like that the character who's casting the shadow doesn't necessarily have to be a villain, and he isn't, seemingly, in this episode. He's quite sympathetic. He doesn't want to use it on anyone. He does actually do it by the end of the episode, but he's doing it because he thinks it's the only way he can stop it from hurting anyone else. But it is intriguing in that sense, though, because it's not just, a villain. I mean, arguably the shadow itself is a villain, and even this character played by Shaloub, Dr. Banton, who, we talk about throughout the episode, he seems to think of it as some kind of, like, entity, that something's attached it to himself, and that he's worried that if he dies, then this thing will be untethered, and it won't have to be attached to him anymore, and therefore can just go around and do what it wants. And it's all related to dark matter. He's a scientist. He get caught in a room with a particle accelerator and got blasted with it. It's very old school, like, superhero origin story, like, or supervillain, either way. Like, how they get their superpowers. They get trapped in the room at the last second with some science experiment, and lo and behold, this is what happens. So yeah, and I think generally speaking, though, I really enjoyed the episode, and there's lots of fun bits, and I like the beat to beat of the case, and Mulder and Scully kind of like going down the breadcrumbs. Even though, and I am going to critique this as well, I do think some of it doesn't hold up when you think about it, like, in hindsight. When I go back and think about some of the threads that we're following early on in the episode, they do kind of feel a little bit either just dangling, and I guess you just call them a red herring because they didn't really lead anywhere, or in one particular case, they actually sort of feel a bit convoluted because they're basically a red herring. They're wrong about something, but it still leads to finding Dr. Banton, which makes it feel very coincidental and convenient for the plot. And if anything, it feels like maybe a scene or two got cut or something that maybe tied them all together a little bit better. And it was not something that bothered me as I was watching it because I didn't know what the outcome was going to be. But once you learn, like, more stuff throughout the episode, and then you think back to some of those earlier scenes, a few things don't quite add up, or they add up kind of in a weird, convoluted way. But I'll get into all that. So yeah, the cold open of this episode is Dr. Banton comes into a hotel and he goes to bang on a door to see someone. And this is actually one of the plot threads that I feel like was never brought up, really, is who he was there to see. I don't think it ever really comes up. Maybe he tells Mulder and Scully who he was trying to see later in the episode. Tell me in the comments if I've just forgotten or missed that. But I don't think it ever comes up who he was trying to see. But he's trying to bang on this door, and it's on the opposite door in the hallway where just an innocent bystander, some businessman who's like settling down for the night with a scotch, comes up and listens to this racket out in the hallway, and the shadow, as mentioned before, goes under the door and like kills this guy. You see him sort of sucked down a little bit. You don't see the whole thing, but you see like a flash of light coming from the other side of the door, and Tony Shalhoub's like, oh no, like he realizes what might have just happened, and he instantly reaches for the light bulb in the hall and like unscrews it so that he's not casting a shadow anymore. Like, it's a really effective scene. It's really fun. I like kind of the bait and switch where we're actually following this innocent, like, business guy to begin with. Well, as innocent he can be. He works for a tobacco company, but although he doesn't like tobacco. It's so funny, actually. They really emphasized what his job was, and they even, like, pointed out that someone else in the episode had a job relating to that. But even the characters just kind of shrug it off, and Mulder says, half the people in this city work in that industry, it doesn't mean anything. And it turns out it never comes up again later, so I guess it didn't mean anything. But it felt like they really made an effort to point it out, which is strange, I guess. That said, I mean, Dr. Batten does smoke a lot in this episode. Maybe they were going for some connection there that I wasn't quite getting. But anyway, so I like the bait and switch where we're following this guy who turns out to just be the victim rather than the character we're going to be following. And this leads to the local detective who used to be taught by Scully, who's now a new detective and wants her help. So Scully's brought in Mulder to look at this case. There's like a burn mark on the floor where this guy like gets sucked into the shadow, and we find out that there's been a previous missing persons with this same burn mark in a house somewhere. This woman who I think this was the one who worked for some either the tobacco company or some anti-tobacco company. But Mulder and Scully go and investigate that person's house as well. One thing I do have to point out here that I'm sure people also love, but I it's the sort of thing where I love this reference they put in here, but I do think they over-explained it almost a little bit too much, or well, not over-explained it. They didn't explain it, but they made it a little bit more direct than because basically they're in this hotel room and the detective's explaining that the hotel door was locked from the inside. The man had asked for a wake-up call. He never responded. There's no there's no sign, there's no fire escape, there's no way someone could have got in or out of the room. And Scully goes and like crouches down and looks at like a little vent and is staring at it kind of intently. And the detective says, what's up, Agent Scully, or whatever. And Scully just says, nah, it's probably nothing. And that right there, I thought was a great reference because it was just a little visual of like they're presented with like a room where seemingly no one could have got in. It was locked from the inside and someone disappeared and died, seemingly. Scully's looking at the vent because she's thinking of the one big case that we've had in X-Files before where that's been a similar predicament, and it was Squeeze, right? And Toombs who went through the vents and all that. I loved this reference. I liked it a little bit less when they kind of made it a bit more on the nose, where the detective actually says, oh, you don't think someone squeezed through there, do you? And then Mulder says something like, oh, you'd be surprised. That little tacked on bit I didn't like as much, but I did like Scully just having like a little freaked out moment of looking at the vent and being, oh god, not again. Like that on its own I thought was great. The little tacked on bit where they sort of wink at the camera with the even using the word squeeze. I could have done without that, but I did like the main part of the reference. So full points on that. But yeah, so Mulder and Scully go and investigate this woman's house that was the previous victim, and they find a train tag in the garbage. And obviously the man at the hotel had also just arrived in town via train. He was there for a business meeting of some kind, which is fine. All of this is fine, right? But this is actually the plot thread that feels a little bit weird to me in hindsight, is that because they find a train tag here, and both victims so far had been at the train station on the day of their disappearance, Mulder jumps to the idea that, okay, maybe this isn't spontaneous human combustion, which was his first theory, by the way. Maybe this is someone hunting people. Someone is stalking the train station and following people home or to a hotel and killing them somehow, right? We don't know how yet, but that's what his theory is. And that's fine. Like, at this point in the episode, I was into this. I liked this trail of breadcrumbs. And then we even see Tony Shalhoub's character at the train station looking very nervous. And I'm like, okay, this is all kind of coming together. But the weird thing about it, though, is that this actually leads to the squad car that's sent down there to sort of monitor the situation actually runs into Tony Shalhoub, and the two cops that come out of the cars get killed because they step in front of the shadow that's getting created because of the headlights of the cars. It's a fun sequence. It's a really cool scene, right? I had a good time with it. But the problem with all this is that then, of course, Mulder and Scully look at the tapes of the train station. They eventually see this guy sitting there looking kind of agitated, and they do the trope of like, oh, enhance, zoom in and enhance, and they see the badge of where he works, the laboratory that he works on his jacket. which, it wasn't too egregious. They didn't like actually enhance it that much, but it did feel like it looked a lot better zoomed into this tiny VHS tape than it really should have. I don't believe for a second they could have read what that badge said on that tape. But whatever, right? Minor trope quibble. That's fine. And that leads them to go to the lab and talk to the other guy, the other scientist, and find out about how this guy went missing in the accident with the particle accelerator. And it's like, okay, this is all fine. It's all interesting even. Like, I was really into like all this like sense of discovery. But the problem with the train station thing is that it basically turns out that he is not hunting anyone, right? He didn't hunt the person. I mean, the first victim wasn't actually who was in the hotel to see. He was there to see someone across the hall. So the fact that that guy at the start of the episode had been in the train station was a complete coincidence. And then the fact that the woman that he went to see, because later on he says to Mulder and Scully that he went to see her the night he had his accident, to talk to her, and she got sucked into his shadow by accident, presumably because he didn't understand how it was working yet. Obviously he's very scared of what his shadow can do now, but that must have been one of the shocking first like tragedies that happened with this new thing. It doesn't seem like he like was there because she had been at the train station. I mean, maybe he knew she was coming back into town that day because it's someone that he knew. And he was there to see her or something, but like there's no real reason that the fact that both victims had been at the train station is nothing but a complete coincidence, which is fine on its own. I don't really care about that, but the problem is that it turns out that the character they're looking for is hanging out at the train station just for a different reason. So that part feels very coincidental and just convenient, I guess, for the sake of the story. I mean, unless I'm missing something here, right? I mean, maybe he was waiting at the train station for this woman that he knew, the first victim, and that's when he realized that this spot in the train station doesn't really cast any shadows because of all the diffused light, right? That's why he hangs out there. Mulder figures that out a little bit later. And maybe he realized that because he was waiting for this woman to come home because he knew she was arriving back in town. And it wasn't until they get back to the house that she gets sucked into his shadow and she died. Maybe that's the case, right? But it still doesn't really have any connection to the second guy because that's not even who he was there to see at the hotel. And like I said earlier, I don't think we ever even find out who he was there to see. I think the name he said was like Morrison or something like that, but that's not the name of the other scientist that we meet. So I don't know who he was looking for. But all of these details feel like they don't quite mesh up all that well, and I wonder if there is like a scene or two that was cut for time or something with it maybe gave us a more decent reason for some of these coincidences or why he is at the train station. I mean, I know why he's at the train station, right? We've established that he knows this spot that doesn't cast any shadows, but just, something that connects it to the fact that this woman was also at the train station. I mean, I've kind of made up a reason that it's probably just that. Maybe he, let's say it played out like I said, and he meets the woman at the train station, nothing happens to her, they get to her house, and then the shadow, kills her. Maybe on reflection, he's thought about this and said, wait, why did that happen now and not at the train station? And he's realizing that when they met at the train station, they were standing in this general area and she was safe because there was no shadows. Maybe that's how he put some of those things together. And maybe there was a scene explaining that or showing some of that and they got cut or something. I don't know. But this connection of the train station stuff all felt a little bit convoluted and just whatever. Admittedly, not so much when I was watching it. I wasn't really thinking about any of this as I was watching the episode. I was just enjoying the breadcrumb to breadcrumb of like, okay, the train, reason to think he's at the train station. Okay, he's at the train station. But the reason they thought he was at the train station isn't why he was at the train station. But he's still going there anyway. So we're still going to find him and then the episode will just progress from there. And then from that point on, it doesn't matter like why any of these victims were at the train station. The victims themselves are almost irrelevant once we sort of just figure out why it's happening, and it's more about what we can do with this now and how do we help him, stop him from hurting anyone else. And then a large chunk of the back half of the episode ends up being about the government or the powers that be trying to get to him because they want to study and use this to their own benefit because they're evil and, you know, the usual X-Files stuff. And some of that stuff is good as well. Like, it's funny because I felt quite positive on this episode. I quite like it, and I feel like mostly I'm like tearing it apart of the bits that I don't think work very well. But this is actually one of these cases where I'm kind of picking at it because like I really like it, and I just think that it would be really special if it didn't have these things to sort of like pull it apart a little bit, right? Because there's a lot of good things in here. All the scenes where someone gets sucked into a shadow are either fun, or at least in one case towards the end, a little bit like unintentionally funny, because the visual when you just get a wide shot of it happening is kind of silly. But even that's got charm, so I'm not even complaining in that sense. I would keep all of the convoluted things that I mentioned, or the threads that feel a little bit convenient, if they just sort of did what I asked for first, which is like really, really like be strict on the rules of where the shadow is at all times and show the audience that, like, that's the thing I want more than anything. All the other stuff I can live with. I just wish they really emphasized like where his shadow was at all times, and if there isn't a shadow, then make it clear with a wide shot. Really have us thinking about it the whole time. Anyway, where does the rest of the episode go? And what else do we do? So they end up getting to him because Mulder and Scully go to the train station, right? After these cops disappear, the young detective that asks for Scully's help on the case is now freaking out because she asked for this squad car to be down here, and she's not actually told her superiors that she asked the FBI for help, and she thinks they'll be quite pissed at that. So she's kind of like put these cops in danger by asking them down here, and then they've ended up dead. Now, she couldn't have possibly known that it was going to be that dangerous, but, you know, like, she's feeling the pressure of that. But Mulder and Scully come to the train station, and Mulder kind of realizes what Tony Shalhoub might have been looking at, which is just the idea that he's looking down and seeing that there's no shadow. He's making sure at all times there's no shadow. And then Tony Shalhoub's character, Dr. Banton, shows up at the train station, and they give him a bit of a chase, and they corner him near some train tracks, and they're getting close to him, and he yells out, "No, it'll kill you, it'll kill anyone." And Mulder looks down at the shadow and sort of realizes, but Scully doesn't stop moving, and she's on the other side of him. So she's walking towards the other shadow. So Mulder, in the moment, shoots out the lights, right? There's a couple of light bulbs in the area. He shoots them both out. And immediately Dr. Banton sighs this big sigh of relief. And it's like he's thankful that he's not hurt anyone else. And Scully's maybe a little on the confused side, but Mulder's maybe at least figured out to some extent what's going on here, right? Maybe not why it's going on. I mean, he knows about the particle accelerator at this point, but I mean, in terms of the actual science of it and what's happening, I mean, who knows, right? It's interesting because, like, if you told me you got blasted with all this stuff and now his shadow does this, like, I wouldn't have leapt to there's some third party in his shadow. But that's where Banton goes with it. That's what he thinks. He thinks there's something tethered to him, which is fair. Like, I don't have a problem with that. That's kind of interesting. It's kind of like like I say, some sort of like interdimensional force that's now attached to him. So supernatural, but I wouldn't call it like a ghost. I'd call it more something else, something cosmic horror-esque almost, is what it feels. Which is why I like it. I like conceptually what they're playing with here. But they've got him in like a light controlled room that's got soft light, and Mulder and Scully come and talk to him. And there's an interesting sort of like bit here where this is where he, like, we really introduced the idea of him worrying that the government is coming for him because they want to use this for themselves, and he doesn't want that to happen because he thinks it could be super dangerous and, you know, all the other reasons you'd expect. But this is also where the young detective like tells Mulder and Scully to stop talking to him, and then her and her superior basically tell them that they can't be involved anymore. They have no authority to be here because they're not officially on the case. And the young detective, she kind of, you know, sides with her boss and kind of throws them under the bus a little bit. And Mulder's a little miffed at it, although Scully kind of sticks up for her and says, you know what, she's doing what she needs to do to like stay afloat in the boys club, and I kind of like get it. Like I've been there. Like I kind of like that moment actually. Scully kind of sticks up for her, even though she also got thrown under the bus, because she's realizing that if this young new fresh rookie detective screws up and pisses off all the men that she works with, which is, you know, it's a predominantly male industry. Is industry even the right word? I don't know, employer, I guess. That, you know, it'll make her life difficult going forward, and Scully's also had to deal with that sexism. I kind of like when they give little bits out like this. Whenever like it's not necessarily brought up and talked about in depthly, but you get a little line here or there where Scully just kind of alludes to the fact that she's had to work a bit harder to be noticed, that she's had to work a bit harder to be taken seriously. I appreciate it being in there in these little ways here or there, because it feels like it's a part of her character that comes up when it's relevant. And I'm not saying we can never focus on it. I think we could have a great episode at some point, really dealing with her having to fight against like a lot of the assholes around her, possibly Mulder included, depending on what the story is. But I do appreciate how they've peppered it in up until this point. They've done it a ton of times, but it's been like maybe 3 or 4 now where they've just had her like have a little reference to her past or a comment on how things are done, where you get like a sort of more layered character in terms of like, you know, how she's dealing with things. And keep in mind, this came out, you know, the X-Files started in 93, so we're into, you know, 93, 94, 94. So we're in like towards summer 95 now, if I'm doing my head math right. But regardless, X-Files started only like a year or two after Silence of the Lambs came out. And I do think there is, you know, even just the way that Scully's like hair was like sort of made up in the start of the show is very Clarice Starling from Silence of the Lambs. And a big theme of that movie is how she has to like try and prove herself in the FBI around all the men around her. It's something that movie like it's there the entire time. If you watch that movie and sort of pay attention to what it's doing with its subtext and how it's like showing her compared to all the men that work at the FBI, it's really a big theme in that. And I think I like X-Files peppering that in for Scully throughout the show, even if it's not necessarily the focus of what we're doing. It just makes her character feel a bit more layered. So another great little moment there, just like the squeeze reference earlier on. This is where the episode takes that interesting kind of turn, where Mulder goes to Mr. X to try and see if Mr. X knows anything about this guy, this doctor, and why the government might want him. And Mr. X says he doesn't know him, but he asks, who is he? And Mulder explains he's a scientist, a physicist, and explains to some extent what's going on. And Mr. X just kind of says, no, I'm not helping you. Like, I thought I told you to not contact me unless it was absolutely important. Mulder gets pissed. But the one thing that's important here is that Mr. X does make a point of asking Mulder where Dr. Batten's being held, right? Before he kind of says, no, I'm not going to help you. And then Mr. X actually features quite predominantly throughout the rest of this episode. Mr. X shows up that night to the hospital, or I think it's a hospital. So it's like a mental hospital, I think they're keeping Dr. Batten in. But and I'm kind of like drawing some conclusions here, but it seems like him and whoever he's working with have cut the power to, you know, the building, right? Or the street or whatever. And he comes in with his badge and he says, hey, because of the power outage, we're going to transport Dr. Batten. And this is him making a move to get the doctor for himself and for whoever he's working for. And I think this episode does raise this question of like, what are Mr. X's, what's his motives? Like, is he actually a good guy? He does refer to Deep Throat as his predecessor, which would make you hope and think that he does have better intention. Although, having said that, Deep Throat was also working with some of the bigwigs in the government. And that was a question we had in season 1, is like, is Deep Throat, you know, secretly a bad guy just managing Mulder by giving him some breadcrumbs here or there? Or is he actually working against the powers that be by working with Mulder in secret? his death would seem to indicate that he was leaning towards the latter, right? Just because he was willing to put himself in that situation and die. But regardless, obviously we got other motives for him as the season went on. Mr. X has been a bit harsher, of course. He's been a bit tougher, a bit more headbutty in some cases. And Mr. X here seems to, like, whether or not he knew about Dr. Batten before he met Mulder, now that he does know about him, he's coming to collect him. He's trying to, like, take him for, like, the powers that be. Now, is that the overall powers that be that are kind of the villains of the show, or is Mr. X working for a more specific group within that's doing their own thing, or is this all about, I don't know, like, is trying to piece why he's doing this is kind of one of the questions this episode really poses for us. But he has two cronies that go in to get Banton get killed because, like, the emergency, like, backup generator lights come on, and instantly the two guys that go in to get him, get sucked into black shadow holes. So Benton walks out of the cell, looks over at Mr. X. Mr. X stares at him and just kind of, like, lowers his gun and backs away because he's like, yeah, I can't take this guy. All he has to do is, like, have a shadow hit me and I'm dead. This was actually one of the scenes where I felt like there should have been a shadow already on Mr. X. Like, you could see a light pointing, like, towards Banton from behind him. So the shadow should have been cast right at Mr. X, and it just wasn't. So it felt like they were cheating a little bit here, which is one of the reasons why I was saying I wish they were really, like, constantly proving to us that they were being accurate with the lights as best as they could in most of the scenes. That's not to say that they have to be 100% accurate all the time, but always make it feel like there's a wide shot here or there to prove to us that, hey, there isn't, right? If they're cheating on some of the close-ups, that's fine, right? Whatever. But, like, give us a shot to prove to us that in general in this scene, it's not a problem. Anyway, so yeah, he leaves. He just sort of leaves the building. Dr. Batten ends up going back to his lab and asks his colleague, the other scientist, to explain to Mulder and Scully everything that happened. He wants to get hit with the particle beam again to basically just, like, die and send this thing back to wherever it came from. He thinks this will stop it from just being untethered if he just dies on his own. So that's what he wants to do. And the big sort of reveal here is that when he gets locked in the room with the particle accelerator, the other scientist, Davy's his name, he, like, is talking to him through this, like, sort of little window in the door, and it's a really big thick metal door. So this little window is like a sort of really, like, it's like a long kind of tube almost that they're looking at each other through. He basically reveals here that he's working for them, for the, the government, the powers that be, whatever you want to call them, and that he then goes to call someone from the powers that be and says, yes, I've got him, you can come and get him. As Tony Shalhoub's yelling, you bastard, and he's really upset about it. Then Davy, this other scientist who's just betrayed Dr. Batten, is shot in the back. He dies at his desk. And then we get maybe the most effective moment of direction in an entire episode, where Dr. Batten's still trying to look through this, like, little window in the big thick metal door, and he's like, you could tell he's maybe heard the gunshot, and he's like, Davy, Christopher, are you there? And we get this great moment where Mr. X just sort of slides into the little window, and it's a very kind of like horror movie style moment that makes Mr. X super intimidating, right? Where, like, everything here in this episode really makes it feel like Mr. X is more of a villain than perhaps, you'd be hoping for. Now, the fact that it's doing that makes me assume that the opposite is true, and that we're going to find out later he's got a lot of good reasons for doing some of these things, and that we're going to, like, see him as more of a heroic figure by the end. But that's just my meta, like, how stories are written brain sort of try to decode it and sort of see it in advance. But it's interesting. Anyway, the moment is fantastic. It's a really good moment, the way he slides into shot, and just this horror of him having nothing that he can do. Also, I should mention that on the way here, the young detective lady that knows Scully try to hold Dr. Batten up at gunpoint. She, confronts him in the lab, and Dr. Batten makes the choice to walk forward and put his shadow underneath her so that she then is sucked into the shadow. So this is the only person in the whole episode, seemingly, that Batten chooses to intentionally kill with his shadow demon, whatever you want to call it. Now, he does so because he thinks that by going to the particle accelerator and dying that way, it will potentially save the world, right? It will stop anyone bad from getting their hands on this thing, whatever it is, and duplicating it or using it to their own gain, whatever it may be. So he's got like a pretty good reason, but it does feel like a big moment because he's never chosen to do it to anyone else, right? Before this point. So Mulder and Scully show up. They see the particle accelerator turn on, and it looks like Dr. Batten's just been killed by it, and they think that's a wrap, right? Scully goes to the young detective's funeral, and whatever else happens, and Mulder, it turns out, shows up at the funeral and says, "Hey, that other scientist, Dr. Davy, disappeared. The day that Dr. Batten died, Davy disappeared." And Mulder's got the theory that because they never got a good look at his face, they only saw him kind of on the sort of fuzzy security camera in the room, that maybe it was actually Davy's body that was in there getting hit with the beam, and that means that Dr. Batten's still alive somewhere. This is revealed at the end of the episode. So there's two scenes with Mr. X towards the end of the episode. There's another one with Mulder speaking to him, where Mulder demands to know and says, "You killed him, you killed Dr. Batten," and says a bunch of stuff. Mr. X makes it clear that he's never promised Mulder anything, and it doesn't matter if he's loyal to Deep Throat or whatever. He has never promised Mulder anything. And there's this moment at the end of the scene where, despite the fact that Mr. X is being just as hostile as he usually is, if anything, he's more hostile towards Mulder in this episode and is very stern with him. But at the end of this scene, he yells Mulder. Mulder turns around and Mr. X says, "I didn't kill him." Now, the way he says it makes it sound maybe in the moment that all he means is that he personally didn't kill him, but that someone else did. Obviously, the ending reveals, as Mulder's theorizing this, talking to Scully, is Mr. X is in some secret lab, some government place somewhere, walks in to talk to a scientist, and the scientist says, "Yeah, we're going to be studying this guy for years." And the end of the episode is Dr. Batten still alive. He's strapped Clockwork Orange style to a chair, and they're flashing light at him, and there's a shadow being cast on the wall behind him, which, so they're doing tests, they're doing shady stuff, and maybe this will come back in some way sometime. The shadow demon, if they can maybe they can make technology out of it or something and replicate it as a weapon. I don't know. I would assume that's what they would want to do, just because that tends to be what governments want to do with things, is make weapons out of them. But it's a fun ending. This is it's such a weird episode now that I'm thinking about it in hindsight, because the back half of the episode is more about what Mr. X is willing to do and where his not allegiance lies per se, but is he really just a straight up bad guy? And if he isn't a straight up bad guy, for all we know, he's taking Dr. Batten himself to a secret group that's studying him because they're trying to fight the powers that be, rather than just taking him to the powers that be themselves, the actual government. I don't know if there's competing factions or something within that space yet. The show's not really giving me that yet. But if it isn't that, then Mr. X is just kind of doing some really bad stuff. Unless he's doing this because this will lead to him having more power, therefore he can help more and do more against them or something. There's lots of facets to it. But the episode definitely makes him feel a bit more intimidating, a bit more villainous, and a couple of effective scenes as well, may I add. But it's curious. It's a very curious presentation in the back half of the episode. But it does kind of take away from the fun of what the main gimmick of the episode is, which is this idea that if you step on this guy's shadow, you'll be sucked into a black hole and die. That's a really fun premise. And it is almost a little bit of a shame that the show, or the whole episode wasn't specifically about of how do we get to this guy, and like more scenes where this is a potential risk, where he's in a location where lights are on or changing or something, and like I feel like there's more set pieces you could do with this. There's more like fun ideas you could do with this, where maybe like someone has to try and sneak up on him, but like, his shadow's being cast behind him or something, and like maybe that could lead that could be like a fun suspenseful moment, or like maybe someone has to rig a certain lights a certain way so the shadows always go in a. In fact, what if someone like at one point in the episode, like I said, Dr. Batten intentionally chooses to kill the policewoman with his shadow because she's stopping him from doing what he thinks he needs to do. What if like a bad guy used his shadow as a weapon? What if we got a scene where someone intentionally shined a light on him because they wanted to kill the person standing like on the other side of him? That could be a really interesting scene. That'd be a cool little moment, right? If someone needed to kill someone else, and they knew that if they just made a shadow go a certain way from Tony Shalhoub's character, they could do it in the blink of an eye, and it would be very easy to do. Like that, like I don't know. There's more fun ways you could play with it, I guess. And I do kind of wish it kind of went into that stuff a bit deeper. And it does feel like the back half of the episode moves away from having fun with it and more about just the conspiracy side of it, which is actually pretty interesting in this episode's case because it's more about Mr. X specifically, and like, can we trust him? Can Mulder trust him? That stuff is actually pretty good. Sometimes the conspiracy stuff bogs me down a little bit in the show because I don't really care about the grand scheme of it per se. But I'm a bit more interested in Mr. X on his own and where he lies and everything. In the same way that Deep Throat became more interesting once we got more of his like individual story. You know, with the whole like history of the alien that was killed or whatever from Roswell. Like when it got into that stuff, that fleshed out that character a bit more, and I feel like this is fleshing out Mr. X more. So I do appreciate a lot of what's in the back half of this episode. I almost just wish though it was in like another episode, or maybe if this was a two-parter and we kind of went into that in the second part or something. But all that is to say, I had a good time watching the episode. The pacing was very good. Some of these like nitpicks I had were more stuff that I thought about in hindsight rather than as I was actually watching it. But you know, obviously I'm coming to do a review, so I do think about the episode I've watched a little bit and try and sort of like settle on what my feelings are and like, you know, how effective was it. You know, it does your creepy, the government's got the evil thing and they're doing stuff with it. You know, the ending, right? They've done that ending a bunch of times, but it's effective here. Seeing him sit there Clockwork Orange style and just having this light blinking is a really cool visual. So there's a few good visuals in this episode, actually. Yeah, and even, you know, if you want to take it a little bit further and say, in terms of like symbolism, you know, could you argue that this idea of standing in someone's shadow leading to your demise, like, I don't know if you could sort of extend that to like, you know, being in the shadow of the government itself, and like anyone who's caught in there is just sort of trapped within it, kind of thing. I don't know. Maybe I'm reaching there, but I think you could probably try and, you know, wring out some extra symbolism there if you really wanted to. Yeah, it's a good episode. It's a good, entertaining episode with a really cool concept that is almost only hurt by the fact that they could have done even more with it. And I kind of wish they did do even more with it. So I hope in some way this premise returns in some fashion. I don't know if Tony Shalhoub might come back or not, but even if he doesn't, like I would like this premise to be revisited at some point, because there's definitely more to get from this, I think. And I would be down for more of that. So, or hell, someone make a horror movie where this is the premise, right? Obviously not all of it, but like the basic raw idea of like someone's shadow is the thing that's dangerous. Because there's so many things you could do with that, right? And how you can manipulate it with people just using lights in certain ways could be so much fun. So yeah, that was my thoughts on the episode. I feel like with this episode, it took me a long time to just explain the events, and I don't know if that's because I liked it more, so I was getting into more detail, or if it was actually just a lot more. There was just a lot more to go through in this episode. I'm not sure, but yeah, lots of things I liked in here for sure. I think the character of Banton, he's not perfect. Like, there's definitely more fleshing out you could have done, but I do think him being this character who obviously is burdened with this, he doesn't want to be this and thinks it's dangerous and wants to try and stop it from hurting anyone. I think that makes him more interesting than just being a villain who has this ability, certainly. I like how it fleshes out Mr. X's character a little bit. Scully has a couple of cool little moments as well, as I mentioned. So, overall, pretty good, but it could have been amazing. So, I don't know if that's overall feels a bit more negative than I want it to sound, but because I had a good time. But that is Soft Light. Let's see what's coming next time on X-Files, shall we? Next episode is called Our Town. And it's not the finale either. There's 25 in this season, which is wild. But here's the description on IMDb. Reports of foxfire on a field in Dudley, Arkansas lead to Mulder and Scully to a bizarre situation regarding the townsfolk. Employees of the Chaco Chicken Corporation, the CCC, if you will, are displaying bizarre behavior, and the death rate is slowly increasing. I mean, there's a photograph of Scully holding a bucket of chicken. I really don't know what to expect from this, to be honest. The rating's pretty decent, so I'm not expecting a dud by any means, but I have no idea what to think about that based on that description, so I guess we'll find out next time. That's been the episode, everyone. I feel like I rambled a lot in this one. So if this was a terrible review compared to normal, let me not know. I don't want to know. Don't tell me. I'll just I'll just internally try to improve next time. Oh dear. Oh, jeez. Anyway, thank you very much for joining me. Of course, you can support all the content by going over to patreon.com/MailFuzzTV and supporting over there. Helps me keep all these reviews coming. That wasn't a sentence that made any sense. But yeah, I can do this as much as I do, both on the TV channel and on the movie channel, because of Patreon, because of YouTube memberships. So any support is greatly appreciated and helps keep everything coming. So thank you very much for joining me. I know the schedule's been kind of weird recently. Last week there was a bunch of interruptions that delayed things. This normally doesn't go out midweek, but I didn't want to delay it until the next normal day it goes out, because I felt like it'd have been like 2 weeks and a half since the last episode. So I thought, no, I'll just get it out, and I'll get to the next thing tomorrow. So thank you very much for joining me. I always appreciate it. Keep watching X-Files. Keep watching TV. Have you got any vanilla?